I have sat in this chair for over 2 decades, and I have looked into the eyes of thousands of people who are absolutely convinced that they are right and the rest of the world is wrong. But there is a specific kind of delusion that has emerged in recent years, a toxicity born from the digital age that I find particularly dangerous because it doesn't just distort your reality, it completely replaces it. I always say that you cannot change what you do not acknowledge. And today, that principle was tested to its absolute limit. When I looked at the case file for Jessica, a 24-year-old woman who believes she is on the brink of global stardom, I didn't just see a spoiled child. I saw a young woman who is drowning in a sea of validation, using her parents as a life raft that she is slowly puncturing with every swipe of a credit card. Her family wrote to me because they are terrified. They are watching their daughter morph into a stranger, someone who values the appearance of success over the dignity of hard work, and they feel entirely helpless to stop it. They titled their plea for help, "My Family Thinks I'm Out of Control." But Jessica, she walked onto my stage thinking the title should be, "My Family is Holding Me Back from My Destiny." And right there, in that gap between out of control and destiny, is where the tragedy lies. When Jessica first walked out onto the stage, the atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. I watch people's body language very closely. It tells me the truth long before they open their mouths. Most people, when they come onto this show, have a certain level of apprehension. They know they are about to answer hard questions. They know the lights are bright and the audience is real. But Jessica, she walked out like she was strutting down a runway in Milan. She paused for the applause. She flipped her hair. She checked the monitor to make sure her angle was right. She wasn't treating this like a crisis intervention. She was treating it like a press tour. She was wearing an outfit that likely cost more than her parents' mortgage payment, holding herself with an air of superiority that was almost blinding. But I looked closer, I looked past the designer labels and the professionally done makeup, and I saw the jittery energy of someone who is terrified that the music is going to stop. She sat down, crossed her legs, and looked at me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was a rehearsed smile. It was a shield. She was ready to sell me a product, and that product was her brand. Her parents, Linda and Robert, sat on the other couch, and the contrast was heartbreaking. They looked exhausted. That is the only word for it. They looked like two people who had run a marathon carrying a boulder and had finally collapsed at the finish line. Linda was clutching a tissue before we even started talking, and Robert had his arms crossed tight across his chest, a defensive posture that screamed frustration and defeat. They loved their daughter. That much was clear immediately. You don't come on this show if you don't care. You come because you have run out of options. But love, as I have told people time and time again, is not enough. You have to have boundaries. You have to have consequences. And what I saw sitting across from Jessica was a pair of parents who had loved their daughter into a state of paralysis. They had given and given until they were hollowed out, and now they were looking at me to be the bad guy, to be the wall that they were too afraid to build themselves. I started by asking Jessica simply how she saw the situation. I wanted to hear her narrative before I dismantled it. She leaned forward, eager to explain, and told me that her parents just didn't get it. She used words like investment, networking, and manifesting. She told me that the $50,000 she had racked up on her father's credit card wasn't debt, it was startup capital for her lifestyle brand. She explained that in her world, perception is reality. If you look rich, you attract wealth. If you look famous, you become famous. She spoke with such conviction, such absolute certainty, that if you didn't know the facts, you might almost believe her. She truly believed that buying a $3,000 handbag was a business decision. She believed that flying first class to Miami to party with strangers was market research. It was a fascinating and terrifying glimpse into a mind that has severed ties with cause and effect. She wasn't living in the real world where you work, you earn, and then you spend. She was living in a fantasy where you spend, you post, and the universe rewards you. But here is the thing about fantasies. Eventually, someone has to pay the electric bill. And in this case, that someone was Robert, a man who has worked in HVAC repair for 30 years, getting up at 5 in the morning to crawl into attics and basements so his daughter could sleep until noon and order delivery salads that cost $30. I looked at Robert and I asked him, Bob, how does it feel to hear your daughter call your hard-earned money startup capital for a business that has zero revenue? I watched his jaw tighten. He looked at Jessica, and for a moment I saw the anger flare up, but then it was instantly doused by fear. He said, Dr. Phil, I just want her to be happy. I want her to succeed, but we're bleeding out here. We can't sustain this. He wasn't angry enough. That was my first mental note. He was still trying to protect her feelings while she was actively setting fire to his financial future. This is a dynamic I see constantly. Parents who are so afraid of their child rejecting them, so afraid of being the bad parent, that they become accomplices to their child's self-destruction. I turned back to Jessica and asked her about this lifestyle she was so committed to. We rolled a tape of her social media presence. It was a montage of luxury cars she didn't own, hotel rooms she didn't pay for, and parties where she was essentially a prop. On screen, she looked confident, wealthy, and carefree. But I paused the tape on a shot of her holding a bottle of champagne in a VIP section of a club. I asked her, who are these people around you? Do they know you? Do they care about you? Or are you just a body in the room to make the table look full? She got defensive immediately. She told me these were her connections, her network. She insisted that this is how business is done in the modern world. She accused me of being old-fashioned, of not understanding the influencer economy. And look, I am the first to admit that the world has changed. People do make money online. People do build brands. But those people usually have a product, a talent, or a work ethic. Jessica had none of those. She had an image. She was selling a lifestyle she couldn't afford to an audience that didn't care, funded by parents who couldn't say no. What struck me most in those early moments was the complete lack of empathy she showed for her parents' distress. When Linda started crying, talking about how she had to delay her retirement because of the credit card bills, Jessica didn't reach out to comfort her mother. She rolled her eyes. She actually sighed as if her mother's pain was an inconvenience, a distraction from her spotlight. That reaction told me everything I needed to know about the depth of the pathology we were dealing with. This wasn't just about money. This was about narcissism. This was about a young woman who had been the center of her parents' universe for so long that she truly believed she was the center of the actual universe. She viewed her parents not as human beings with needs and limits, but as resources to be mined. And resources don't have feelings, they just have utility. I knew that if I was going to get anywhere with Jessica, I couldn't just talk about the money. The money was the symptom, not the disease. I had to get to the core of why she felt this insatiable need to present a fake version of herself to the world. Why was Jessica from Ohio not good enough? Why did she have to be this fabrication? I looked her dead in the eye and asked, what happens when the phone turns off, when the filter comes off? Who are you then? For a split second, just a microsecond, I saw a flicker of panic behind her eyes. That was the crack in the armor I was looking for. She quickly covered it up with a scoff and a hair flip, telling me I was being too deep, but I saw it. There was a scared little girl in there, hiding behind a wall of designer logos. And my job, my mission for the next hour, was to tear that wall down, brick by brick, until she had no choice but to face the reality she was running from. To understand how we got to this point, you have to look at the history, because people don't just wake up one morning and decide to bankrupt their parents for the sake of an Instagram aesthetic. This kind of entitlement is a slow-growing weed. It's cultivated over years of peace at any price. I spent some time talking to Linda and Robert privately before the show, and what I found was a classic case of what I call over-parenting. They both grew up with very little. Robert's father was a hard man who believed a job well done was its own reward, and that affection was something you showed by putting food on the table. Linda came from a home where resources were scarce, and she had to wear hand-me-downs until they were threadbare. When they had Jessica, they made a silent pact, as many parents do, that their daughter would never want for anything. They wanted to give her the childhood they never had. But the problem is, when you give a child everything they want, you rob them of the opportunity to develop the muscles required to earn what they need. As Jessica grew up, she was the miracle baby. She was pretty, she was smart, and she was the center of their universe. Every whim was met. If she wanted a specific toy, they found a way to get it. If she had a conflict at school, Linda was in the principal's office the next morning defending her. They weren't just raising a child, they were insulating her from reality. By the time she hit her teenage years, Jessica had learned a very dangerous lesson, that her desires were mandates. She didn't learn how to negotiate, she didn't learn how to compromise, and she certainly didn't learn the value of a dollar. To her, money was just something that existed in the mom and dad ATM. It was an infinite resource, and any attempt to limit it was seen not as a financial necessity, but as a personal attack, a betrayal of their love. The escalation began when Jessica graduated from high school. While her peers were looking at colleges or trade schools, Jessica was looking at her phone. She saw people her age living in mansions, driving exotic cars, and wearing clothes that cost more than her father's truck. She didn't see the years of hustle, the production teams, or the heavy debt many of those influencers were actually drowning in. She just saw the finished product. She told her parents she didn't need college because she was going to be an entrepreneur. And because they were so desperate to see her succeed and so afraid to see her fail, they agreed to fund her gap year. That 1 year turned into 5. 5 years of her living at home, sleeping until the afternoon, and using their credit cards to build her image. I asked Robert when he first realized things were spinning out of control. He told me about a night 2 years ago when he sat her down to show her the mounting debt. He had it all laid out on the kitchen table, bank statements, overdue notices, the works. He told her, "Jessica, we can't do this anymore. You need to get a job at the local mall. Just something to start bringing in some money." He said she looked at those papers like they were written in a foreign language. Then, she didn't argue. She didn't apologize. She had a full-blown emotional meltdown. She told him that he was killing her dreams, that he was stifling her creativity, and that if she had to work a normal job, she would lose her spark. She threatened to move out and never speak to them again. And what did Robert do? He folded. He apologized to her. Think about that for a second. A man who had worked his fingers to the bone for 30 years apologized to his unemployed daughter for asking her to help pay for her own lifestyle. That is the power of emotional blackmail, and Jessica is a grandmaster at it. From that point on, the floodgates were open. Jessica realized that all she had to do to get what she wanted was to turn up the emotional heat. If the parents said no, she became depressed. If they mentioned a budget, she became suicidal. She weaponized her mental health to keep the checks coming. She started taking trips to Los Angeles and New York, staying in boutique hotels and charging it all to Robert's card. When the cards were declined, she would call home screaming, telling them she was stranded and unsafe, forcing them to take out payday loans just to get her back. It was a cycle of crisis and rescue, and every time they rescued her, they were just teaching her how to be a better victim. I looked at Linda during this part of the conversation, and I could see the guilt etched into her face. She told me, "Dr. Phil, I feel like I failed her. I feel like if I had been a better mother, she wouldn't be so unhappy." I stopped her right there. I told her, "Linda, you aren't failing her by saying no, you're failing her by saying yes." This is a concept that is so hard for parents to grasp. They think they are being kind by shielding their children from the consequences of their actions. But in reality, they are being incredibly cruel. They are sending their child out into a world that is not going to be kind to them, a world that doesn't care about their spark or their dreams if they can't pay the rent. By the time Jessica arrived on my stage, she was 24 going on 14. Emotionally, she was stunted, trapped in the developmental stage of a toddler who thinks if they scream loud enough, the world will give them a cookie. The tension in the house had reached a breaking point about 3 months before they contacted me. Jessica had decided she needed a professional wardrobe for a networking event in Vegas. She went out and spent $6,000 in one afternoon. When Robert found out, he finally had a come-to-Jesus moment. He canceled the cards and changed the locks on the house. For 48 hours, he stood his ground. But Jessica didn't go get a job. She didn't check into a shelter. She sat in her car in the driveway and posted live updates to her followers about how her abusive parents were homeless shaming her. She tagged local news stations. She made herself the protagonist in a drama where her parents were the villains. Linda couldn't take the pressure. She couldn't take the neighbors staring. She broke, she opened the door, let Jessica back in, and gave her a new credit card just for emergencies. Within a week, that card was used for a deposit on a luxury car lease. As I sat there listening to this, I felt a deep sense of frustration, not just with Jessica, but with the entire system that allowed this to happen. We live in a culture that celebrates the hustle but ignores the work. We see the glitter and we want it, but we don't want the grit. Jessica is a product of that culture, but she is also a product of a home where boundaries were suggestions and consequences were non-existent. I knew that I wasn't just going to have to talk to Jessica. I was going to have to do an autopsy on this family dynamic. I had to show Robert and Linda that they were the ones providing the fuel for this fire. If they wanted the fire to go out, they had to stop being the wood. I turned the conversation back to the stage, looking at Jessica, who was checking her reflection in the lens of a camera. I asked her, "Do you have any idea what your father does for a living?" Not the title, but the work. "Do you know what it feels like to crawl under a house in 100-degree heat to fix an AC unit?" She shrugged. She said, "He's good at it. He likes to work." I looked at Robert, and I could see the pain in his eyes. He didn't like it. He did it because he had a daughter who thought she was too good for the very life that was providing her with everything she had. The disconnect was total. There was no bridge between her fantasy and his reality. And my job was to build one, even if I had to drag her across it kicking and screaming. The atmosphere on the stage was thick with a kind of tension you can only find when a family has reached its absolute limit. I've been doing this a long time, and I can tell you that the loudest person in the room is usually the one with the least to say. Jessica was talking a mile a minute, throwing out buzzwords like engagement metrics, algorithmic reach, and personal branding. She was trying to intellectualize her way out of the fact that she was a 24-year-old dependent who hadn't earned a dime in 3 years. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a practiced sincerity, and said, "Doctor, Phil, you have to understand, the world is different now. I'm building an asset, my face, my style, my life, that is the asset. You wouldn't tell a farmer not to plant seeds, would you? My parents are just the initial investors." I let that hang in the air for a second. I wanted the audience, and more importantly, I wanted her parents to really hear the cold, calculated way she was describing her relationship with them. She didn't see them as a mother and father. She saw them as a venture capital firm that didn't have the right to pull their funding. I looked over at Robert. His face was a shade of red that genuinely worried me. He's a man who believes in the dignity of a day's work, a man who has calluses on his hands and a mortgage that's 3 months behind. To hear his life's blood referred to as initial investment for a girl to take selfies in a rented Tesla was almost more than he could bear. I decided it was time to move from the what to the how. I asked Jessica to explain her business plan. I told her, "All right, walk me through the math. You've spent $50,000 of your father's money. You've got another $20,000 in high-interest credit card debt. You have 30,000 followers on social media. Tell me the conversion rate. Tell me exactly how many likes it takes to pay for a transmission repair on your dad's truck." Because right now, the math is not mathing, Jessica. You are living a 5-star life on a 0-star income, and the bank is about to close the curtains on this whole show. She didn't like that. People like Jessica, who live in a world of curated images, absolutely loathe the cold, hard light of a balance sheet. She started to get agitated, her foot tapping a frantic rhythm against the floor. She told me that I was focusing on the wrong things and that big things were in the works. She claimed she was in talks with several major brands. This is a common defense mechanism, the phantom success that is always just 6 months away. It's a way to keep the enablers hooked. "Just 1 more month. Dad, I'm about to sign a huge deal." It's the same thing a gambler says right before they put the last of the rent money on red. I turned to Linda. I asked her, "How many times has she told you a big deal was coming? How many times have you extended the deadline because she promised she was on the verge of a breakthrough?" Linda looked down at her hands, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Every month for 3 years. She tells me she's going to pay us back tenfold. She says she's going to buy us a house in Malibu." I want to believe her, Dr. Phil. I really do. She's my daughter. I want her to be that successful girl she says she is. And there it was, the hook of hope. That is what keeps parents like Linda and Robert trapped. They aren't just investing in Jessica. They are investing in a dream that validates their own parenting. If Jessica succeeds, then all the sacrifices were worth it. If she's a star, then they didn't fail. But if she's just a spoiled girl with an internet addiction and a shopping problem, then they have to face the fact that they've spent 24 years raising a stranger. That is a bitter pill to swallow, and most parents will do anything to avoid taking it. I looked back at Jessica and I dropped the hammer. I said, "Jessica, let's be real. You aren't an entrepreneur. You're a squatter. You are squatting in your parents' bank account, and you are using their fear of losing you to keep the lights on. You say they are holding you back, but the truth is they are the only reason you aren't under a bridge. If they stop paying for your phone today, if they stop paying for your car, your brand would vanish in 24 hours because your brand is built on their labor, not yours." She finally cracked. But it wasn't a crack of realization. It was a crack of pure, unadulterated rage. She stood up, her expensive heels clicking loudly on the stage. She pointed a manicured finger at her father and screamed, You're embarrassing me. You ruined everything. I was supposed to have a meeting tomorrow, and now I'm going to look like a joke because of this. You don't care about me. You just want to control me. The audience gasped, but I just sat there. I've seen this movie before. This is the diversionary tactic. When the logic fails, turn up the emotion. When the facts are against you, attack the messenger. She was trying to make her father the villain for the crime of being broke. Robert looked like he had been slapped. He shrank back into the couch, that old familiar guilt washing over him. This was the moment where he usually folded. This was the point where the parents would usually start apologizing just to get the screaming to stop. But I wasn't going to let that happen. I looked at Robert and I said, Robert, look at me. Don't look at her, look at me. Is this the daughter you raised? Is this the spark you were so afraid of stifling? Because what I see is a bully. I see a young woman who is using your love as a weapon to beat you into submission. Are you going to let her do it on my stage? Are you going to let her scream at you after you've spent 30 years breaking your back for her? Robert looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a spark of something other than exhaustion. I saw a spark of self-respect. He took a deep breath, stood up, and looked his daughter in the eye. He didn't scream back. He didn't have to. He just said, Jessica, sit down. I'm not apologizing anymore. I'm done. The cards are gone. The car's going back. And if you want to be a brand, you can go be a brand on your own dime. I'm tired, Jesse. I'm just so tired. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd heard all day. Jessica froze. Her go-to move, the explosive anger, had failed. The wall she had spent years building had a giant hole in it, and she didn't know how to fix it. She sat back down, but she didn't look like a glamorous influencer anymore. She looked small. She looked like the frightened child I had sensed earlier. The bravado was gone, replaced by a raw, naked uncertainty. We were finally past the escalation. We were finally at the confrontation. Now, we could start talking about the truth. I leaned in, softening my voice, but keeping it firm. I told her, Jessica, the reason you're so angry isn't because your dad is controlling you. You're angry because you know, deep down, that you are a fraud. You're terrified that if you stop pretending, there's nothing underneath. But let me tell you something, there is something underneath. There's a human being who doesn't need a filter to have value, but you'll never find that person as long as you're chasing this ghost of a life. You're chasing a finish line that doesn't exist. You've got to stop running and you've got to stop digging. I saw the first real tear then. Not the for the camera tear, but the kind that comes from the gut. She didn't wipe it away. She just sat there looking at her father, who was still standing, refusing to back down. This was the breakthrough moment, not a happy ending, but a beginning. It was the moment where the power dynamic shifted, where the fantasy met the reality, and where a family finally started to deal with the truth of what they had become. The silence on that stage was heavy, the kind of silence that rings in your ears long after the shouting stops. I looked at Jessica, and I didn't see the brand or the entrepreneur anymore. I saw a young woman who was suddenly, terrifyingly aware that the stage was empty and the audience had gone home. When you build your entire identity on a house of cards, the first gust of real truth doesn't just shake the structure, it levels it. I let her sit in that discomfort for a minute. I've learned that we often try to rescue people from their own silence too quickly. We want to fill the void with words because the truth that lives in the quiet is too painful to face. But Jessica needed to feel that pain. She needed to feel the weight of her father's exhaustion and the emptiness of her own promises. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, getting into her space. I said, Jessica, I want you to look at your mom and dad. Really look at them. They aren't initial investors. They aren't characters in your social media feed. They are two people who are nearing the end of their working lives with nothing to show for it because they gave it all to you. And you have treated them like an unlimited data plan that you can just keep roaming on without ever paying the bill. Do you realize that if we don't fix this today, your father will likely die at his job? He won't get a retirement. He won't get a gold watch. He'll get a heart attack in an attic somewhere because he was trying to pay for your next flight to Vegas. Does that image fit into your lifestyle? She started to sob then, and for the first time, it wasn't the performative, look at me crying. It was the messy, ugly, snot running down your nose kind of crying that happens when the ego finally breaks. She looked at Robert and said, I didn't mean for it to get this bad. I thought if I could just make it, I'd pay you back everything. I didn't want to be a failure. Everyone I know is doing so well, and I felt like if I didn't look the part, I'd never get the chance to be the part. This is the comparison trap, and it is a pandemic in our society. We compare our behind-the-scenes footage with everyone else's highlight reel. I told her, Jessica, you were so busy trying to look like you were winning that you actually lost everything that mattered. You lost the respect of your father, you lost the trust of your mother, and most importantly, you lost your own integrity. You've been living a lie so big that you forgot what the truth even feels like. You say you don't want to be a failure? You are failing right now by being a person of zero character. Success isn't a zip code or a designer bag. Success is being a person of your word. Success is being able to look in the mirror and like the person looking back, even if that person is wearing a uniform from a fast food joint. I turned to Linda and Robert. This was the most critical part of the intervention. I knew that if they didn't leave this stage with a concrete, unbreakable plan, they would cave the moment they got to the parking lot. I've seen it happen 1,000 times. The parents get stage brave, but the moment the lights go down, the old patterns of guilt and enabling creep back in like a fog. I said, listen to me and listen close. You two have to stop being her dealers. You are addicted to her approval just as much as she is addicted to your money. You think you're being loving, but you're actually being her worst enemy. You are funding her delusion. Starting today, the bank of mom and dad is closed. Not limited, not restricted, closed. I laid out the soft landing versus hard ground reality. I told them that Jessica had to move out within 30 days. No exceptions. She needed to get a job, any job, within 48 hours. I told Robert he had to take her phone off his plan and she had to get her own. If she couldn't pay for it, she didn't have a phone. It sounds harsh to people who haven't lived this, but when you're dealing with a dynamic this toxic, you have to perform a surgical separation of the finances. You have to force the individual to interact with the world on the world's terms, not theirs. Jessica tried one last time to negotiate. She asked, but what about my car? I need a car to get to a job. I looked at her and didn't blink. I said, there's a bus, or you can walk, or you can sell some of those $3,000 handbags you've got sitting in your closet and buy a 10-year-old Corolla. That's what adults do, Jessica. They solve problems. They don't just export them to their parents. I could see the gears turning in her head. She was looking for a loophole, a way to keep the fantasy alive while doing the bare minimum. I told her, if you spend one more ounce of energy trying to game the system instead of joining the system, you are going to end up alone and broke. Your network of influencers, they won't be there when the money runs out. They are there for the champagne and the lighting. They aren't there for the struggle. Your parents are the only ones who are actually in your corner, and you have been spitting in their faces for years. It stops today. Robert stood his ground. He looked at Linda, then at Jessica, and said, Dr. Phil is right. I love you, Jessie, but I'm done. I'm changing the passcodes on the accounts tonight. You have 30 days to find a place, and I'll help you move your stuff, but I'm not paying a dime of rent. You're a grown woman. It's time you started acting like one. Linda was crying, but she nodded. She reached out and took Robert's hand. That was the most important moment of the day, the parents forming a united front. That is the one thing a narcissist cannot defeat, a solid wall of no. We spent the rest of the hour breaking down the psychological why behind her behavior. We talked about her fear of being average. To Jessica, average was a death sentence. She had been told she was special for so long that the idea of a normal, quiet, hard-working life felt like a failure. I had to explain to her that there is an incredible dignity in the average. There is dignity in showing up on time, doing an honest day's work, and being a person people can count on. The extraordinary life she was chasing was a mirage. The ordinary life she was running from was where the actual joy was hidden. I offered Jessica a path forward. I told her I would provide her with counseling not to help her build her brand, but to help her build her character. I wanted her to talk to someone who could help her untangle her self-worth from her net worth. I wanted her to understand why she felt she wasn't enough just as she was. She looked at me, and for the first time, the defiance was completely gone. She looked exhausted. She looked like someone who had been carrying a heavy mask for years and had finally been allowed to drop it. She whispered, "I'm scared, Dr. Phil." I told her, "Good. You should be." Fear is a great motivator. It means you finally realize the stakes are real, but you aren't alone. You've got parents who love you enough to finally tell you the truth, and you've got a choice to make. You can be the girl who went on TV and got embarrassed, or you can be the woman who went on TV and finally grew up. The choice is yours, but the clock is ticking. As we went to break, I watched the three of them. They weren't hugging yet. There wasn't a movie moment where everything was suddenly perfect. It was awkward, it was painful, and it was real. Robert and Linda were looking at their daughter with a mix of love and newfound resolve, and Jessica was looking at the floor, probably wondering how she was going to survive the next 24 hours without her father's credit card. But the outcome wasn't about her being happy in that moment. It was about her being honest. And for the first time in a very long time, the truth was the only thing left in the room. The lights dimmed as we walked off the stage, but the weight of the reality they were stepping into followed them like a shadow. I've seen this play out 1,000 times, the stage brave moment where a parent finally says no, only to have it crumble in the parking lot. But Robert and Linda were different. There was a quiet, grim determination in Robert's eyes that told me he had finally hit his threshold of pain. You see, people don't change until the pain of staying the same becomes greater than the pain of changing. Robert had reached that point. He was done being a bank. He wanted to be a father again. He was tired of the sleepless nights and the constant fear of the next credit card notification. He was tired of being an accessory to his own financial ruin. The first few weeks after they returned to Ohio were, by all accounts, a tactical battlefield. Jessica didn't go quietly. She used every weapon in her arsenal: guilt, tears, silence, and eventually a full-blown extinction burst. She tried to rally her online friends to her cause, posting cryptic messages about being betrayed by her own blood and being financially abused by parents who didn't understand her vision. And she even recorded a video of herself crying in her room, claiming she was being silenced. But a funny thing happens when you stop providing the stage for someone else's drama. The play has to close. When her father didn't react to her social media posts, when her mother didn't call her crying after she sent an angry, manipulative text, the power dynamic shifted. For the first time in 24 years, Jessica was shouting into a void. I had my team stay in close contact with them. providing the resources and the aftercare support I promised, and the reports were fascinating. On day 14, the car that luxury lease her father could never truly afford was towed from the driveway. Jessica stood on the lawn and screamed until her voice was raw. She expected Robert to come running out with a checkbook or, at the very least, an apology. He didn't. He didn't even look out the window. He was inside, having a quiet cup of coffee with Linda, talking about their retirement plans for the first time in a decade. That was the moment Jessica realized the bank of mom and dad was truly out of business. The ATM was broken, and no amount of screaming was going to fix it. By day 20, the hunger for her old life was replaced by a more literal hunger. She had no money for the high-end delivery salads she loved. She had no way to pay for the high-speed internet she used to curate her fake world. She did something she hadn't done since she was a small child. She asked her mother for a meal. Linda, following the plan we had established, didn't give her money or a gift card. She simply invited her to sit down at the family table and eat what they were eating. No special orders, no luxury, no organic imported greens, just a home-cooked meal and a conversation about reality. It was the first time they had sat at that table without an argument in 3 years. It wasn't a perfect dinner, but it was a real one. The transition wasn't Hollywood clean. It was messy. It was hard. Jessica eventually took a job at a local retail store in the mall. She hated it at first. She complained about the hours, the standing, the customers, and the disrespect of having to clock in. But she did it. She had to. And as the months went by, something shifted in her. She stopped talking about manifesting and started talking about her shift. She stopped posting photos of rented cars and started posting about the small apartment she managed to rent with 2 roommates. The brand she was so obsessed with died, but a human being was born in its place. She found that she actually liked having her own money, money that didn't come with strings or lectures attached. She found a different kind of influence, the influence of being a reliable employee and a good roommate. I look back on this case as a textbook example of the enabling loop. We live in a culture that rewards the appearance of success. And as parents, we are often so afraid of our children falling behind that we give them a head start they haven't earned. But you can't give someone a head start on character. Character is forged in the struggle. It's forged in the no. It's forged in the moments when you have to figure out how to survive because no one is coming to save you. By saving Jessica from every minor inconvenience, Robert and Linda were actually stealing her life from her. They were keeping her a permanent child in a woman's body. They were funding a delusion that would have eventually left her entirely alone in a world that doesn't care about your brand if you can't pay your rent. Today, Robert is no longer crawling into those 100-degree attics 5 days a week. He's cut back to part-time. He and Linda took a small vacation, the first one they've had in years, that wasn't interrupted by a crisis call from their daughter. And Jessica, she's still struggling. She's not rich, she's not famous, and she's not an influencer in the digital sense, but she is something much more important. She is responsible. She's a person who pays her own bills and keeps her own word. She's learning that the extraordinary life is actually found in the ordinary moments of integrity and hard work. I always say that you have to name it to claim it. This family named the entitlement, they named the enabling, and they claimed their lives back. It wasn't about the $50,000 in the end. It was about the dignity that money had bought. They learned that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's a slow-motion car crash. They walked away from that crash, and they're finally walking toward a future built on solid ground. They realized that you can't build a house on a foundation of likes and shares. You need bricks and mortar, and those are only found in the real world. This family was out of control because they were living in a world without consequences. Now, they are back in the real world. And while it's harder, it's a whole lot healthier. They've learned that the only way to truly manifest a good life is to get up, show up, and do the work. And that, folks, is how you change a life. You stop talking about what you want to be, and you start being who you are. The lights are off on this case, but for the first time, the future for this family looks bright.